Awesome. Well, so nice to be here with you all this afternoon. And just a huge thanks to Emily and Nicole for inviting me to be here. I have never done anything like this, so this is scary and exciting for me. And yeah, again, my name is Carrie Van Horn, and I work as a contract artist, science illustrator in the conservation and science communication fields. And I just want to preface this again that my typical role is as a listener and a conduit for information and an artist, not as a presenter. So thank you all so much for just being with me in my growth space today. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, perfect. So I'll start and just give you all a little bit of background information about me and kind of how I got to this place of being a contract artist in the conservation science communication fields. So I was an artist from the time I was super little, and like so many people who are young and love to draw, I was told that there is no way that that could be a successful career. You should definitely do something else. So I decided to pursue my other passions of environmentalism. I worked in environmental education for some years and then studied conservation with a human dimensions focus, and then worked on municipal climate change efforts before interestingly kind of coming back full circle and finding my way to art again. And I decided to see if I could make it work, to combine those passions of creating art and my passion for the environment and really create this niche and see if it could be a successful way to work. So I started Heartwood Visuals about 6 years ago, and I actually now work as really just a digital illustrator, which is super interesting. I did start with my work on paper and then shifted during the pandemic to doing digital illustration. And now that is, I would say, about 90% of my work is all digital. And most of it is custom illustrations, from super simple illustrations to really complex illustrations. I make quite a lot of short illustrated videos, like the one that Emily mentioned. And then I also occasionally do live illustration at conferences and events. This is sometimes called graphic recording or scribing. All right, so kind of to start as a foundation, I was thinking a lot about why blend art and science in the first place. Like, why is this something that is valuable and really worth putting time and money and energy into? This is not an exhaustive list, of course, but these are things that I have definitely noticed in my experience, of combining these two fields. The first is emotion. We all know that humans are driven by emotion, and art has the potential for a really, really deep emotional response. Emotion is also deeply connected to memory, and memory helps us keep our attention on these core messages that we really, really want our audience to be hearing. Another thing that I was thinking a lot about is connection to place. I would say most of the art or the projects that I'm working on are super place-based. And I think probably a lot of your work is very place-based too. And art and things that are place-based really can connect us to the world around us, connect us to our sense of place in it, can help foster a deeper connection to these places. In addition, connection to each other, I think, is a really, really important thing that art can elicit. One thing that I was thinking a lot about is the feeling that you get when you receive something that is human created, handmade from a friend. Like, that feeling is a feeling that I really try to evoke in the art that I make. And I think that art has this power to really deeply connect us to each other. communicating complexity. This is obviously a very, very important one in the science and conservation fields. And in my opinion, this is the hardest thing to do. This is something that I'm thinking about constantly. And it really is this kind of delicate dance of conveying the most important messages that you need to convey while not losing that greater context, not simplifying things too much, but really making the complexity of these issues that we're working on digestible for a broader audience. And the last one is using art as a universal language. Art, I think, has the power to connect to a great diversity of people and really function as that kind of common uniting language. And really, the goal, and one thing I think a lot about in the art that I create, is how do we bridge socioeconomic, political, urban, rural, cultural divides by really leaning on this universal language. So one thing that when I did a little bit of brainstorming with Nicole and Emily was how, like Emily mentioned, like how does your brain work, Carrie? How do you approach these projects? So I really thought deeply about this and tried to kind of simplify it down to the core process and kind of the core elements that I'm thinking about when I'm creating a video, an infographic, an illustration. But to start, Nicole shared this quote with me. The artist is not a special kind of person, rather, each person is a special kind of artist. And I believe, like, what a beautiful quote, first of all. Thank you, Nicole. Um, I strongly believe that every human is an artist. You may not see yourself as an artist, you may not think that you are a good drawer or that you can create art, but I think that art is something that is really a birthright for all humans and something that we all can do. It might look different from person to person, but yes, this is a strong belief of mine. So I challenge you all based on, these things that I'm going to share to try to incorporate a little bit more art into your own work and your own daily life. So overall, my process is I always draw with visual support. So I am someone who draws what I see. There are some artists out there who just have these truly magical brains that they can pull images out and just draw from their mind. I can do that a little bit just because of the repetition of the number of times I've drawn some things. But for the most part, I am leaning really heavily on reference images, other art, illustrations, and really drawing what I am seeing. When I'm starting any drawing, I always, always start with super simple, basic shapes and lines, and then add in the details from there. And I also always stick with a super simple color palette to begin with. I think that simple art can be incredibly powerful, and you can always add more to it. But that is sort of how I approach each kind of individual drawing that I'm doing. And then one thing I am always thinking about before starting a project is the composition of that piece, whether it is an individual frame of an illustrated video, an infographic, or just a single illustration. So the composition is kind of the layout on the page of your different elements. And I will block that out excuse me, really, really simply with just kind of like, where am I going to draw the anchor image? Where am I going to have a title? Where am I going to write these different things? And then one thing I'm thinking about always with that composition is the movement throughout the piece. So how does the eye kind of move through it? And I think this can be really, really powerful for when there are really core messages that you want your audience to make sure they're getting. Are those getting lost, or is your eye really seeing them clearly when you move through a piece? And then every composition has three spatial elements in it. It has your positive space, so your subject, your negative space, so the area around your subject, and then the frame or the boundaries of whatever you are drawing. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is the value of that negative space, the area around your subject. And what this can do really powerfully is it can really focus your eye on your subject. It can also help with that movement piece. And I think most importantly, it allows for space to breathe and space to really digest the information. I'm sure you all have had the experience of looking at a document or a piece of art or something that just was super, super busy and you just get lost in it. And I think that a lot of my early work was trying to do way too much and included way too many details. And this concept of negative space is something that I am really still working on and that I'm trying to think about in every single piece that I create. And then, really, overall, I think that the value of just creating visuals and seeing the story can help you really process and refine that story as a storyteller, whether you are someone who's working with a contract artist or whether you are sketching and drawing and brainstorming for yourself. So, yeah, I hope this gives you kind of some helpful tips of where to start if you're thinking about doing some sketching on your own. So, if you do decide to collaborate with a contract artist, I thought of just a couple of the essential things, helpful things, and some other considerations that I think will really help make the process go as smooth as possible and will help that artist create the best possible end product for you with, considerations for your budget and time and energy going into it. The first is having a super clear vision and the essential details that you want to include. This sounds incredibly obvious, but I have had a huge spectrum of experiences of working with folks who've had a really, really clear vision to people who their vision is super murky going in. I think this is something that, it's okay if that's not super clear, but the clearer it is, I've noticed that the stronger the end product at the end of a project. Also, having clarity on your audience and how you plan to use the piece. Obviously, things like clear timeline, budget transparency on both ends can be super helpful. And having those final product specs, especially having that at the beginning of a project rather than halfway through near the end, deciding that you need different specs, that can be pretty challenging for an artist then to have to adapt the work they've already done into your new wanted dimensions or resolution, things like that. And a couple helpful things, having ideas of the illustration style that you like. I think that, you can approach an artist that you really like their style, but do not be afraid to bring them other art. I am constantly being influenced and I'm growing from seeing other artists' work. And I love it when folks are like, we really like this thing that you made, but here's this other thing that I saw that I really like too. And, artists love to be able to kind of merge their style with other styles. So that can be really, really helpful to have, as well as color preferences if you have those. And then reference photos if your project is place-based. Most of my work is place-based. So usually I'm like, yes, please give me reference photos. But this is something that can be really helpful. And I will also often pull colors from reference photos for a color palette. So that's another reason that they can be really great to have. And then a couple other considerations. This is something that actually Emily brought up that I had not thought about at all, that everyone visualizes things a little bit differently. So when I work on a project, Typically, I am working with just 1 to 2 points of contact from an organization, and usually we'll have a meeting kind of with a greater group of their team first, but then it's usually kind of on that 1 to 2 folks that I'm working with to work with their greater team to kind of bring together all of their different ideas about kind of how they want to visualize something. And yeah, it's just something to think about how you want to navigate that. And yeah, maybe Emily can share some more tips on that. And then another thing that I was really thinking about is that it's not necessarily about the art, but it is about the process of the scientist, conservationist, communications expert, communicating really what they want to share with the artist, and then the artist then interpreting that information into the art. And then I think the real magic then comes from that dialogue and refinement between the two to create that final piece. So yeah, it's fun and it's hard. So there are a couple resources that if you are interested in diving more into the world of visual thinking, creating your own art for your work, these are 2 resources that kind of go from the super simple to the much more complex that have been super foundational for my work. The first is Bicablo is a German company, and I think Nicole probably shared the links. Thanks, Nicole, in the chat if you want to check these out. But yeah, Bicablo is a German company of visual practitioners, and they have a series of visual dictionaries that are composed of super, super simple and accessible, very, very basic drawings. But these drawings have the power to really share super complex ideas. When I started this work, especially when I was doing a lot of live illustration, I leaned really, really heavy on these resources. And I think that they are really helpful for folks, especially who say they can't draw. And yeah, it's a good kind of just foundational resource. And then the other one is a book called Generative Scribing, and it's by the artist Kelvie Bird. She also focuses on something called systems scribing that I think could be really valuable for this group if you are interested in kind of diving into how the inner world of the artist or the creator impacts the work that you do on the outside. From both a systems perspective as well as a generative perspective. And she offers courses. This book is fantastic. It's kind of one of those that I'm like, oh, I'm gonna need to read this like 5 more times, maybe more. And yeah, I think that Kelvie's work in general too, if you look at the illustrations that she does, she has a really incredible ability of drawing things that aren't actually that complex to draw, but they really have a lot of depth and emotion and complexity in them. So yeah, she's an artist that I aspire to create work like her someday. All right. So I am curious to know how you all have used visuals to engage audiences with your complex science conservation efforts, or how you hope to do this. And I'm also happy to answer any other questions you all have. Oh, thanks so much.
It's a good segue. It's interesting to hear about the scribing, generative scribing work. I do a lot of work as a facilitator, and so documentation is so vital. Having participants feel like their voice is both heard and accurately recorded is really vital. But I'd just love it if you could talk a little bit more about like what you feel like graphic recording also brings as a separate art form way to do that. And whether, yeah, like whether there's pros and cons on when that works best to incorporate versus times it might not work well. Anything you can say to that would be super interesting. And thank you. This is wonderful.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nell. Yes, graphic recording, I think, is an incredible tool that honestly, I think it can be effective for small groups to, as large as a big conference. One thing I really would think about is like the timing of pulling in that graphic recorder, both from a cost perspective, but also like, is the group ready for that? Like, is this the right timing? Are we feeling like, you know, and it is tricky because sometimes I think it can be valuable at all points in a process of facilitation and group work, but I do think it's something that needs to be used really strategically. And yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know if am I answering your question now?
Yeah, this is all helpful. Yeah, just like, yeah, exactly. The input you have on like when to incorporate it and why is super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, it's always helpful to kind of hear about like, what are you working on? What's the history of this group? Like, where are you in your process? I'd be able to like more specifically give you thoughts on that. But yeah, it's an incredible tool. And I think something that as a facilitator, if you can incorporate some visual work on your own can be really, really powerful to help a group feel heard and seen. And yeah,
And just to build off of what Carrie shared, Nell, as a facilitator as well, a couple of places that I could see it being really helpful is like at open houses when you're trying to get the community to share what their concerns are, maybe having an artist like help visualize it for them and they can see quickly like what else other people have shared before them and seeing their voices being shared in a visual could be really helpful. Another one that another way I could see it would be is once you've got like your stakeholder group ready to share publicly, having that be the opportunity for them to have a graphic recorder kind of go through like, here's what we want the public to know, here's what we're doing and why it's important. And that could be really great to have visualized when you're wanting to communicate outwardly from the stakeholder group.
Thanks. That's great.
And Julia, I saw you taking your mic off a little earlier and then shared a really cool resource in the chat. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about your American Grasslands page?
Absolutely. And we just took it to CatleCon, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be taking it to Pheasant Fest, so CatleCon for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I dropped the link in the chat there, but we added the murals that we kicked off a year ago, which were requested, was an attempt, and Carrie, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, to really pull in a graphic representation where to pull things together that wouldn't naturally be seen at the same time, but that give people a perspective when we're working in rangeland management. It's a progression over a long period of time. So how can we represent this in a mural in a way that would take several years, but really to show, and in our case, I was focusing on the threat of woody encroachment, right? So how do we show like a beautiful open prairie with no trees to like what happens when trees start to move in to like when you're fully encroached, and how do we illustrate loss in ecosystem services, loss in biodiversity, emphasize the role of grazers on the environment. And they've been really popular, but I'm just really interested in your perspective on like how the big pieces of art and that make a statement, something on a presence, and how to package those up in smaller digestible pieces once you're not at an event and seeing these big impressive things, how to take big murals and break them down into things that continue to help make connections even if you're not at that particular event.
this is so beautiful. Julia, thank you for sharing. Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And my initial thoughts are that, looking at a big piece like this, that it would be pretty easy to like crop sections and use those, of course, like with context of what that part of the piece is showing. And, you know, I think that you could use it in any medium from social media post, you know, things that you're sending out. This is really cool. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun to put together, and I just want to make sure we're maximizing it, really, because doing it justice, because the art itself is so beautiful and it's such a different way for us to communicate our message that I want to make sure we're maximizing it. For CattleCon, we did actually fly in the artist that did the digital art, and it ended up being like a meet the artist kind of had him there. And it was really cool because it was a whole nother layer of discussions when he was talking about with folks about what he connected with while he was putting together the artwork, even though he's not, a rangeland ecologist, like, but his perspective as he was working on the project. It was really cool.
Have you considered QR codes or some kind of like audio storytelling to accompany it while folks are there looking at it?
We got a request last year as an audio, and it's sitting on my front porch right now. We actually designed a sound box. We were trying to decide like how to incorporate sounds. And I know our Working Lands for Wildlife counterparts in the East have one related to Bob White that is more of a tunnel where there's sound playing as you move through a tunnel. But ours, we just got a sound box that we're going to put in front of the panels, and kind of see how sound goes to incorporate it. But it's like we did Bob White, a sage grouse, an elk, a coyote, a meadowlark, and a happy cow. Like, which happy cow noise, like I was very specific, like it has to be a happy cow. So in this case, it's like a mama cow, like being like, hey buddy, where'd you go? But it's not like a angry bellowing like herd. I was like, it needs to be like, these need to be happy noises that like evoke, like we're trying to evoke an idea of like, this is what happy land, like all the sounds in a happy landscape. But that's one's been interesting because like when you go to a prairie, sound is such, it evokes so much. Like, so that's, yeah, we have the same question. How can we experiment with sound to augment the experience?
Carrie in the chat, Carissa has a question. Can you talk about what you use for your digital creation, like an iPad or what app or program is your favorite?
Yeah, great question, Carissa. So I do use an iPad and an Apple Pencil. And I think one thing that was just crucial for me to make it feel more like drawing on paper is there's this product called Paper-like that is it's kind of just like a thin little film that you just put right over your iPad, and it creates some kind of a like friction so your pen doesn't sort of slide around. And that was just huge for me. I can see if I can find the link to it if anyone is interested. And I use an app called Procreate for most of my work, unless I need to create vector art, and then I use Adobe Fresco.
Megan, I saw in the chat you sharing some of the art that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used for promoting the Endangered Species Act. Would you like to share a bit more about that campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see, we even use the artwork for staff backgrounds for Zoom and Microsoft Teams. We have a really talented artist here on staff named Cal Robinson, who is also a public affairs specialist, does all the news releases and everything, but also has just incredible artistic abilities. And for the ESA 50 campaign, we proposed the idea to have a commemorative poster to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. And what we did was select a species that's kind of emblematic of each of our 8 regions across the nation. And then Cal went to work using their digital drawing pad to freehand sketch each of those pieces of artwork. And then they were combined into one commemorative poster, but then each species also had their own commemorative poster. And what we did was then, so we launched them on Endangered Species Day. And we had each of the regions write a story about that species, so provide some local relevance, and then we promoted the poster along with the story about that specific species. And it was a week-long launch, and so each poster and each species got their time to shine, and we really focused on recovery efforts. And then, so we pushed that out through social media, and a lot of partners shared it, and it was a great centerpiece and a great way to really jumpstart the year-long celebration.
Nice. Thanks for sharing. When you're working with a client, what questions do you typically ask to try to help tease out like what they actually want to show in their art, or like what's the most important aspect of the science or the conservation project that they're trying to convey? How do you get at the nut of that complexity?
Whew, that's a good question, Nicole. I don't know if I have like specific questions that I ask, but really I just come in and have a discussion around like, why is this important to share with your audience? What do you really, really want people to understand and want to leave them with? How do you want them to feel when they see this? I think those are some of the things that, we talk about. And, I just ask folks to really kind of describe their work, describe like why they care about it. And I find from there, I can, even if like they don't know that this is why they're doing it, like they'll say it. And yeah, is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any recommendations for how to structure like a site visit with a digital artist? Like if we wanted to like take someone out on a reservoir or kind of take them out on the river, what would be a way to structure that would be helpful for the process?
I mean, just that you want and value taking an artist to your site would be incredible. I don't think that in my experience, that's not something that I have gotten to do many times. I think, partially because a lot of the work that I'm doing is not based here in Fort Collins where I live. So, that requires folks to have the budget to send me somewhere to, get to really experience that place. But I think that experience could be invaluable to creating art that really like has that feeling of that place. And, I would say as far as the structure of it, leaving time for that artist to get to just like be there kind of on their own in a way. I mean, I think, all artists are different, but I can speak for myself that I am super introverted. And when I am in the best space to create art is when it's quiet and I have that time in my own head. And I think, a balance of showing them these places, giving them information, talking at them, having discussion, but then also giving them some space to have quiet reflection, time to sketch would be incredible.